welcome back. This is Sky Kirshner in Charleston at KPCC Counseling, and my partner,
Deena Shelton. I am in East Texas, but I work for Concordia University, Irvine in Southern California.
And we're super excited to be doing a little didactic thing, just a little teaching thing, because we wanted to go a little bit more in depth into systems and boundaries. As you saw in the conversation, it's different from talking about the system, which means like the bureaucracy and the different organizations that have rules and are trying to support and trying to do right by everybody. But when Deena and I talk about systems, we're talking about kind of a body of knowledge around theories and thinking about how groups, whether it's large groups or small groups, operate, and the sort of the patterns that they fall into. Most systems develop because it's more efficient. If you start doing things the same way each time, you don't have to think about it as much anymore. So for example, my wife and I, we tend to park the cars in our driveway. She parks in one place and I park in another. And then the other day we switched cars and I went to go park and I wasn't sure, do I park the car where I usually park it, or do I park the car where the car usually goes? And then I parked it where I usually park it, but it was her car in the space. And she came in and she said, you took my space. And it was like, yeah, it's like we had a system, and this is the way all systems get discovered. You don't notice that you've developed a system until somebody does something that changes it. Deena, any thoughts on that? And then we'll look at some slides that we put together.
Yes, I love that. When we say systems, as an adoptive parent myself, the first thing that you think of when you hear the word system is the system of Child Protective Services or Department of Family Protective Services, whatever it's called in your area, and how that interacts with your family. But you're right, systems are everywhere. And these types of systems create sets of rules or expectations across a group of people. So that's what you just outlined there. There was this set of expectations based on the behaviors that you guys had been doing, and you made the best call you could, and it still wasn't what was expected, even though everyone kind of knows what's going on. So it's always fun to see that and how a system that is built affects even our expectations on what's going to happen or how things happen. And I always describe it like a contact lens versus a set of glasses. I think I said this in another training at one point, but that the system is the way you do things, and you're not looking at it, you're looking through it. And so to be able to see the system and look at it has to be a really intentional process. You've got to pop it out and look at it rather than just maybe adjusting to see through glasses. It's kind of fixed, and you don't really realize what it is or what color it is or what shape it is until you pop it out and really take some time to do that. Yeah.
And when you said it's always fun to look at systems, I'm thinking, well, it's fun if people are good natured about it.
That's
but
true.
Sometimes, when you're talking about these rules that get developed, these unspoken rules that get developed, if my wife was in a different person, which I'm very thankful that she's not, but she might have come in and really, read me the riot act. In our case, it was more kind of funny. But that's where I wanted to start off, Deena, is what happens when the system kind of gets discovered, and how do people react to that? And so what you were calling rules, which are kind of the ways of operating that kind of define what the system is. It's not like we had a rule about it. It just kind of happened that way. One car is bigger than the other. And so it's easier to turn if it's parked in the one space in the driveway rather than the other. So, I kind of broke the rule because I did something different. So let's start off by thinking about boundaries. And what is a boundary? Because boundaries are sort of the lines that demarcate what the system is and how the system operates. And then the rule is, how upset do people get if a boundary's been crossed? So let's just think about what kind of boundaries there are and how many you can think of. So if we think about just very concrete boundaries, what are examples of concrete boundaries? Well, we've got political boundaries, and sometimes they're very well defined, like a border between countries, especially if there's a fence or a wall or a river, it's very clear, or between states. Now states are a good, you might not know when you've crossed from one state to another. It's like you wouldn't know when you cross from one county to another, unless there's like a river or something that really signifies, oh, there's like a natural boundary that and we know now that we've crossed it. But you can, if you think about this, some boundaries are very hard to cross. If you're trying to come into the United States from Europe, you've got to prove that you don't have COVID right now, and you might not even be able to get on the plane to come back to the United States if you're overseas. If you're a U.S. citizen right now, non-U.S. citizens, it takes special permission to get in. So some boundaries are very strict and very, they're very well defined. And the rules about crossing or not crossing that boundary are also very strict, sometimes very complicated. And the consequences, if you break that boundary, can be sometimes severe. Let me kick it over to you, Deena, before I get on too much of a roll.
No, that's a great role that you're on, right? Because it's so true. There's so many different types of boundaries, and we tend to have a way that we think about boundaries that's based on a lot of things too, how we understand things, how we grew up. So much about boundaries is more than just black and white, even though that's how we tend to perceive them naturally, that with a boundary, things either are a certain way or they aren't. You're one place or another. There's a line in between, right? But when you get into other types of boundaries, like you had on there ethical and moral boundaries. Now, legal boundaries tend to be more black and white, but some boundaries are culturally based and based on other sets of values and build off of one another and may not be so clear to others, even if we're saying the same thing. So for example, if someone asked you, do y'all have a system for how you park? And you both would say, absolutely, yes, we have a system. And the rules, but the rules are unspoken. And so some boundaries, the rules about them are more rigid than others, but some are unspoken and implicit versus spoken and clear and explicit. And so when something changed, you had to make a call, and it wasn't the call the other person would have made, even knowing the boundaries that were already set up, right? Yeah. And so just because there is a boundary or there's clarity about one area doesn't mean that the next move is going to be perceived the same just because we understand the first move.
Right. And I'm not sure if you had said to me, do you have a system on where you park? I would say no. My wife might have said yes, or if another boundary, so I was mowing the lawn today, and most people, who have lawns would probably be aware of this. Like, how do you decide where the neighbors, where you mow, and where what line do you stop mowing on, and where's, and that's kind of the accepted boundary, right? We mow to here, and then, my neighbor mows this other part. Now, some people, might be very particular about, like where that line is. Some neighbors, and if I try to do a nice thing and I mow into their lawn just to try to help them a little bit, they might come out of say, why are you mowing my lawn? That's not are you trying to take over part of my yard? I thought I was just being friendly, but no, they might take my action in a way that I wasn't intending. And then, and now we've got a nervousness. Now we have some anxiety about what happens, if a tree falls, or a limb falls, can I go over and get it? If we all know the stories of the kids that are playing ball and the ball goes into the mean neighbor's yard, or there, there's a dog there, how do you, so it's gone, because nobody's going to go in there because they don't want to get yelled at. So these are all kind of examples, and like you don't really know what the rules, if you move into a neighborhood, you don't really know what the rules are, right? Until somebody says to you, now, if they've got a fence, then it's clear. Okay, they're interested in their boundary, and it's like, and if they've got a wall, right, and you can't even see through it, then it's even more clear. They don't even want you knowing what's going on in their yard. But if there's no fence or no wall, it's like, how do you learn? How do you pick up kind of what the deal is? And I think, Deena, when we think about kids, especially, not infant kids, coming into a group, a family that's already got all these unconscious or hidden ways of doing things, and the kid comes in and it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know where I'm supposed to sit. I don't know whether you put the forks in the dishwasher with the prongs up or the prongs down. Maybe nobody cares, but maybe somebody does care, and then, if I put them in the wrong way, is somebody friendly when they tell me, or do I get, do people give me a hard time about it? Really tough. And I think when we think about the boundaries, the idea of, I certainly like the idea of flexible boundaries. It's like, so when somebody comes in, I recognize, that right, you don't know how we do this. So, and I'm not even sure how we do this, right? I didn't know that we were all putting the forks up. I was just doing that because that's the way I do it, but I didn't know that was like a thing that we do. And I think we were talking biblically a little bit earlier. I think maybe this is why the idea of being friendly to strangers, welcoming a stranger, is so important, because they're coming into a new culture. They don't know how this thing operates. And being friendly to folks that are new to the system that you've been doing, and you don't even think about it anymore.
Absolutely. I love the property lines and boundaries because we understand that already. And I'm such a big fan of word pictures that help us connect things we already understand to things that we may not understand as well. And so when you think about that, of like where the line is between houses and who mows which part and who's responsible for which part to take care of. And like you said, in different neighborhoods, maybe some people just, mow both sides of their yard so it all looks the same and everybody's okay with that. And in other situations, people might say, hey, you're in the wrong space. That's my yard. And you think about kids coming into our homes who already do have a whole set of how they do things. And even down, and I would say we see this all the way down to infancy. We heard Stacy, who was one of the foster mothers, say, one of the most difficult situations was the baby she had who wouldn't cry and wouldn't signal to her what was going on. That infant, that baby with no language, already has a full way and set of rules and boundaries for how he or she does things. And so we recognize that that exists at all levels. And sometimes we can even blow through those toddler and young child boundaries because we don't recognize that they're there yet either, or we may not be aware that that's what we're seeing. We may just see it as resistant behavior. A kid is placed in our home and they're doing all these things that are outside of our system and way of doing things, our rules and boundaries and guidelines. And we see it as something to be adjusted. And I always would like to make suggestions to parents and then counselors who I'm training to consider what would happen and how they would function as a normal, healthy human being if someone came into their home unexpected in the middle of the night, grabbed them from their bed, put them in a vehicle, and drove them to a country. We're in Texas, so I typically say Mexico because it's close. They speak a different language. Everything is different there. And all you know is that you've been dropped off in a home and they put you in a house and then they just leave. And they say, you're going to stay here for a while. And you don't speak the same language as everyone. You don't understand what any of the rules are. You're not sure how things go, what is allowed or not allowed. And none of us would do very well in that, right? That's not a situation any of us are going to function well in. And so even with that, recognizing that learning boundaries and learning where all the lines are is a normal part of any human situation, no matter what. And that much of what we see in these situations where boundaries may be being pushed or crossed or we're unsure about them is completely developmentally and situationally average, normal issue, because we would all have issues in that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so we have this idea of boundaries, and then we have the idea of what happens if they get crossed, and how do people respond or react? Do people even notice? But if they do, so I can imagine a kid coming in, who might have been subjected to a very rigid systems, and if they did anything outside of the rules, people were really hard on them. They're coming in with those expectations, and how sort of confusing it must be if somebody says, "Oh, no big deal. We put the forks in this way," or this will be your seat. And they're thinking, "I've never had a seat before," and usually the biggest person comes and takes whatever seat I have. And are we good to move to your slide, the next slide?
Yeah, because I think this goes right into this concept of family systems and how our systems, we create these systems, oftentimes not really intentionally, and saying we're going to create this type of system, but where these rules and boundaries and ideas exist, and we may not be aware of all of them. So especially as kids come into our home or our system and family, things are changing both for that child, but also for the children who are already there, biological, foster, adopted kids who are there, the parents. Our entire system and experience changes in a home when a new child comes in, whether there are other children or not. Everything shifts. And so I like to give a little bit of background on what we call family systems theory. And family systems theory came out of general systems theory. It's an ecological principle, and understanding how systems work together. We see it in nature. We see it across, and you said this in an earlier even about boundaries. We see systems across all areas of science and life and experience. And we've taken this and we understand it's been applied to everything from family to business to other types of things. But we look at families as systems. And when we say systems, it's a group of people or even organizations at times, right, that all work together and in conjunction with one another, and that influence or affect each other in the actions and work that they do. That's how I'm defining systems. So when we say the system, and people are referring to the child protective system, right? We're talking about all of the agencies and peoples who are working together or influencing the children who are in our home, the CPS workers, the investigators, the attorneys, the court systems, the therapists. That's typically, it's this all-encompassing verbiage. If you think about a family working that way as a system, you have all of the people in a family, whether they are biological, adopted, foster, recent addition, been there a long time, doesn't matter. They all work and function as a system. And I have three visuals that I like to use to explain a portion of family systems theory. When we look at a family like a system, we can understand it in a few ways. First and foremost, that in a system, anything that one person does in a family affects everyone else in the family. If one person moves, shifts, or changes, everyone else moves, shifts, and changes too. And I like to use a baby mobile. So in this first picture, you can see this cute little baby mobile that would go over a crib. It's got rabbits on it. It's really cute. Maybe it's a couple different animals. But when you think of a baby mobile, just like you're seeing here, the purpose of that baby mobile is for movement for the infant, right? To see moving things and to keep them entertained while they go to sleep. But if you take a baby mobile and you think about this balanced system, it's a balanced system in and of itself. And all of the items hang off, usually at different lengths. If you pull one side of that system, you pull on it and you let it go, they're all going to move, right? Because when one part of a system moves or changes differently from where it is, the whole system tends to shift and everyone else moves to counterbalance so that it can reach what we call equilibrium or steadiness again. The system wants to be stable and steady. And if you think about your family, isn't that what we all want, right? We want peace and steadiness and stable in our house. Everybody just calm down and chill out.
Yeah,
and that's what happens.
We used the word predictability in one of our things, and that's another. I just want to be able to predict what's going to happen here.
Absolutely. And if one person does something off or different, especially if it's somebody who's just come in and doesn't even understand the system and everything's off, we're doing everything we can to get the system back to a normal pace, a pace that doesn't feel chaotic. And so I always encourage the visual of the mobile to understand movement. If one person moves, everyone else has to move. It's just part of it. There's really not an option if you're a part of the system. The second picture is the inside, the back and inside of a watch. And when you see the system pieces of a watch, there are all of these tiny pieces and moving pieces. And if you were to take those apart, any one piece is going to have a name and a function in and of itself. But that piece can't fully function and do what it's supposed to do without the other pieces working with it. Its productivity and what it can accomplish alone is not the same as when it's within its system. Systems are important to understand because we do more together than what we can alone. And with a system, we say the sum is greater, the sum of the whole is, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Sorry, let me say again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if you took all those pieces and laid them all out, you could say we have all of the pieces of a watch here, but it wouldn't be a watch. And when they all come together, those individual pieces become a watch when they are a system together. And so what we have to understand is if you took one piece out of that system or put another piece in, you would have to figure out how to make the system work and accomplish things with or without part of the piece. And maybe you can do that, or maybe it becomes something else and not a watch anymore, right? But that it's not just a watch that you can take pieces in and out of and it just stays the same watch. That's not possible.
Yeah,
and so
the watch is a very delicate system. Right?
Yes.
So you take one piece out and now it's broken.
And it may not even be a full piece. It could be a screw that's holding the piece in and it's not going to function, right? Yeah.
Whereas some systems might have more flexibility in that I understand, like a starfish, if a starfish loses a leg, it grows a new leg, right? So it's able to keep functioning within itself because that's not an essential part. So we've got sort of very complex systems, and then we have more simple systems, and then we have kind of the adaptability of the system. Can the system adapt? Like a watch can't adapt to losing a screw or any one of those pieces. The watch is just broken until someone comes and does something external to it.
Absolutely. And in thinking about that, the watch in and of itself may not be the point. Sometimes we have this idea, my family is a watch. This is what my family is and how it works. And then as things change and move in our family, sometimes it's helpful to let go and say, maybe it's not a watch. Maybe we look at the pieces we have and see what it is. What do we build out of these things, right? Because what if it could be something else that functions and works really well? But if we keep trying to make it a watch without the pieces, then we might just set ourselves up for a full frustrating experience altogether, right? And so you're right about we could use a lot of some systems function very differently from that in terms of the flexibility. And that's the beauty, is that it's not, even if pieces move in and out, it doesn't mean, well, everything's broken and this is not a watch anymore, so none of it matters. It becomes, what else do these pieces do? And how else do they work? And what else can we do for them?
So we have sort of self-correcting systems, like you could take a leaf off of a plant, or you could take a number of leaves off a plant, and that plant will self-correct. It will start growing more leaves. It will do what it needs to do to restore that homeostasis or that equilibrium. And I think the same thing happens with us humans, right? Something isn't working, or something changes, and we are a very adaptable species, right? We're going to figure out how to survive, even if my parents are not feeding me. I'm going to figure out how I'm going to get some food, or whatever it might be.
You better believe it. And then this third picture represents, this is an ecological model is what we call it. And basically simplified, it's concentric circles where you show a person. So in this case, that red dot is the child inside of a family system, inside of a broader community system, inside of a broader societal system. And there are different models of these in different words, but the purpose of showing this visual is to show the bi-directional nature of influence. When you have a family, it's actually part of an even larger system. And this is where the system, the child protective system, comes into play too, because that's going to be in this community system external. And we know 100% that anything that happens on the individual and family level absolutely affects things external to it, and things that are happening external to the family system and the individual are affecting that child and the family as well. And I give a couple of examples of this, kind of like you said, it's easier to understand it with things that we already know. You think about if a child in a foster adopted child gets in trouble at school for something that perhaps indicates that they may have had a different type of abuse than was known before. Then that might initiate a chain reaction of a requirement on the family to report it to the system, a requirement on the system to report and require a forensic interview. And then this child goes for a forensic and it becomes this wave external up to finding that it's not the case, or to legal cases against criminals, right? And then in the same way, I always like to say we know a lot of ways that society affects individuals, but one of the best examples that I give is like a downturn economy. When the economy starts to depress and things are going downward, the divorce rate drops with it. And the lowest divorce rates are in the times of the lowest, economic functionality, or the highest economic stress, because divorce is expensive. And when the economy is down and money is short and things are a problem, problems tend to be focused elsewhere. And the family tends to maintain, even if it's just to try and maintain equilibrium as well. But data tells us every time that economy downturns, the divorce rate goes with it.
Yeah. It's interesting. So in terms of these concentric circles, I was thinking the handle with care. You might have that in Texas, but if the police get called to a home and there was some kind of family disruption, if the system is working well, someone will contact the school, and the counselors at the school, and let them know, hey, Johnny, had a hard night last night. This thing happened, and we just wanted you all to know that, so when the system is working well, that information is getting passed over, because Johnny might not be able to say what happened, and how else would you know what would happen? And so those systems sometimes operate very well in a kind of pro-social, friendly kind of way, friendly to the human beings, and then sometimes the system kind of takes on a life of its own, and sometimes we end up, the system becomes interested in its own perpetuation and forgets that it may have started originally to serve the human beings that were involved. And we've all had that experience when a system seems to be operating in a way that does not seem to be serving any of the human beings involved. It just has become this self-perpetuating kind of bureaucracy. And that can be frustrating as well. We are ready to go on to the next slide? So when we're thinking about systems and boundaries, we've got these four kind of examples of what might be called healthy boundaries, and then three ways that you could have so-called unhealthy boundaries. And these are all, the word healthy and unhealthy I'm putting quotes in it because it's not, an objective kind of thing. It all depends on how is it serving the people involved, and does it enhance their life and their ability to love, or does it make it harder? So in this diagram, we've got the so-called healthy boundaries as being, it's kind of a Goldilocks thing. It's not too rigid. It's not too chaotic. It's just right.
Just right.
Just right. So sometimes if something, let's go start over on the right-hand side, so like a boundary, like a wall that you can't see through, now that might work great for one family, but then the next family moves in and they like the school district, they like the neighbors, but they don't like the wall that much. And because they want to be able to walk back and forth, they want their kids to play easily without having to go through gates. So if a boundary is too rigid, it's like, I don't know how to call my worker, like I can never get through. If you've got somebody who in the bureaucratic system who is is supposed to be connected to you, how does the information flow? And does it flow easily, or is it hard to get in touch with that person? Are they very rigid about when they come to visit? We only come at 4:00 on Tuesdays, but what if 4:00 on Tuesdays doesn't work for you? And do they say, sorry, this is the only time? And then you've got a decision to make as far as whether to conform to that or to do something else. What kind of examples of rigid systems can you think of?
I oftentimes think of rigid systems when I'm teaching about parenting and about parenting boundaries, and specifically when we're talking about the difference as adolescents are growing up and needing some additional responsibility for themselves. And for parents who are very structured and who are very, very intentional, all of the best, the best intentions and ways of doing things, as teenagers get older and start to pull that, sometimes the boundaries can become more rigid, or we respond that way because it feels like it's being pushed back instead of it just being normal development. So sometimes rigid boundaries aren't even just chosen walls. It can be a response to things that are pushing, and we may become more rigid and build stronger boundaries to try and keep things the way that we want them to go, right? Yeah. And so I talk about these rigid boundaries being things like, you have a teenager and you have a rule in the house, and things don't go right because as kids get older, other things come into play. So maybe you tell a kid, not to go anywhere by themselves or do anything by themselves, leave the house if you're gone. But this kid is older and you get caught up somewhere and you can't get a hold of each other. And that kid has to make a call because they've got to be somewhere. And so they get a ride and go somewhere else. And how you respond to that, if it's, well, that was the rule and it doesn't matter that things changed, that can be a real rigid boundary that has to have some more flexibility as they get older, versus knowing how to connect with older teenagers who have to learn how to make calls for themselves too, right?
Yeah, the consequence of having too rigid a rule is that you're probably going to hurt the relationship. The teen is going to say, well, that's not fair. And they might be right, or, this new thing happened that nobody took into account. And so there can be very rigid expectations, very rigid walls, and there can be rigid consequences if you don't get that thing, if you don't get that paper into the court at the right time. The court is probably a pretty good example of having some rigid boundaries. It's like, you got 90 days to get this in, and if you try to turn it in on the 91st day, they're going to say sorry, and it doesn't matter to them if 5 people in your family had COVID and you were sick, sick to the point of almost dying. I mean, maybe you could get somebody to advocate for you to get more flexibility, but that's so that would be an example of a rigid system. It has to do with how the information flows. How easy is it for information to get passed? Does it have to go through a certain chain of events or a certain hierarchy? Or so for example, in the military, there's a chain of command, and it's a pretty rigid chain of command. If you break the chain of command, you're going to be in trouble. Versus on the other side, a loose or porous one would be if you've got a complaint, you could take it to the sergeant, you could take it to the lieutenant, you could take it to the captain. We're all on a first name basis. These titles don't mean so much, versus if you've got a complaint, you only take it to your immediate supervisor, and then they deal with it and they take it up, or they deal with it at their level. So a loose or porous one, or maybe a flexible one, information can flow in and out. You have different ways of you could tell this person, you could tell this person. I'm on a first name basis with my worker. I have their cell phone number. They're easy to get a hold of. We text back and forth. It's more informal. Hey, how's it going today? Had a really hard, you're not afraid to say, we had a really hard day today, versus I'm scared to say we had a really hard day today.
Yeah.
And then we've got an example of what sometimes are called chaotic or non-existent, where I don't really know what the boundaries are. And either it doesn't matter or it's a big deal. Like, it might not matter which way you put the forks into the dishwasher. Nobody really cares, and it gets done. And there's a lot of appreciation of diversity of different ways of doing things, versus sometimes nobody's telling me, but people care. So I don't have clear boundaries, but the rules are very rigid. That's probably a horrible place to be in. Or nobody gave me any phone numbers. I don't know how to reach them, because nobody said, here's how this works. What's that for you?
And I think, like I said, I think about these so often. The things that come to mind are about parenting and parenting styles, because I think about these porous boundaries, or especially limited or non-existent boundaries. When you think about rules in a home and the way that things go, when we watch balanced family systems, and that doesn't matter if it's adoptive foster people coming in and out, or traditional nuclear, 2 parents and 2.5 kids, this is consistent, that the loose and porous and the limited or non-existent boundaries versus the healthy oftentimes relates to consistency. And with the loose versus limited, kind of a continuum of inconsistency, where these loose or porous boundaries I see all the time. And it's probably one of the most stressful systems of that, because with really limited boundaries, oftentimes it's very bad when people are coming into contact with the boundaries that do exist. They're harder and they are more stressful when they come, but most of the time it's, nobody's bothering you. This is where you see a lot of neglectful systems are going to be in this loose boundaries. Nobody's watching, nobody cares. In porous or loose boundary systems, it's typically situations with parents where you have rules that they don't actually care about. And parents sometimes get into a trap of making rules because they think it's important to have them, rather than really determining what really matters for a system. So you might have a parent who says, you have to keep your room clean every single day. And I don't actually check every day. I don't actually even care that it's clean every day. But if it's a rough day and I feel like things are out of control, then I go back and look at the rooms and they're a mess, and I get really upset. And so sometimes even with families, when I'm working with them and we see some of these loose boundaries, we say, maybe it doesn't matter if the rooms are clean every day. Maybe it's that they need to clean them once a week, and you check them once a week consistently, so that there are clear understanding of when. Otherwise, it's maybe you'll check, maybe you won't. And that creates a lot of stress and uneasiness, because it could be or couldn't be.
Yeah, and it's partially dependent on how much anxiety or how much frustration are the parents carrying at any given moment. I love that example about, I was thinking about, grounding a kid for life. If a parent is very afraid, you're grounded
Right.
for the rest of the week, but then come Tuesday, nobody's there to enforce it. Or come Tuesday, the parent is there, but they're just too tired, or they give up. It's so hard. It is hard to be consistent with kids. And the less consistent you are, the harder it becomes, right? Because they, anytime I say something, they hear, oh, maybe he's going to do that, or maybe he's not, or he's doing it right now because he's mad, but he's not going to he's going to forget about it tomorrow. And that winds up, even though you said you're grounded for the rest of the week, the kid knows that's not how it operates. And
Yeah.
so they say, sure, and then you're grounded for a day. And I think, Deena, we're probably going to do a whole discussion about the challenges of co-parenting versus solo parenting. Because what sometimes will happen in this case is the one parent says you're grounded for the rest of the week, and the other parent doesn't agree, and now they're kind of undermining each other. And so when the other parent's involved, it's say, yeah, go ahead, watch TV, go to your friend's house. And this is why, the idea of your united front is so important. The united front has a common understanding of what the boundaries and what the rules are and what the consequences are for when those boundaries get violated.
You're so right. And I think a way to even sum all that up is understanding, because that's one of the most frustrating pieces, right? That a kid's whole world is learning and understanding systems and boundaries. Even if they can't explain that's what they're doing, that's what they're exploring. They're exploring boundaries and systems and what works and what can you do and can't you do, all along with their development. And they have so much brain space, which is why they push on all of it, right? They have so much brain space for this. And it can feel really frustrating as the parents who are trying to especially if you're co-parenting and trying to create a system together, or you're co-parenting with a system that has a set of rules that you all have to follow too, because that becomes another parent. And it gets complicated. But the exciting part, and I do think that there's a whole other conversation to have about this in practicality, is that there's so many more options than just what we typically go to. And so we'll get into those another time.
Yeah. Well, we've doubled the amount of time I thought we were going to be talking, right. But it's always, we just got on a roll, and this is such a fascinating topic. I hope this was helpful to you if you've been watching. We're really excited about our conversations, and I hope you're as excited. And look for us next time. And Deena, it was great to see you. Next time we'll be with our whole posse, and we'll have another discussion. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.